everybody, how you doing? This is Clinton Bond from
Because of
TopCoder.
solar panels are so large, because of where our
academics as well, consulting firms, vendors who want to understand sort of neutral way.
Hi everybody, Clinton Bonner here from TopCoder with another edition of TopCoder Interviews. We got a real special treat for you today. We're sitting down with Jack Andraka, and if you don't know his innovative tale, well, I'm actually going to turn it over right now and let Jack introduce himself and tell you how the heck we got here today. So Jack, welcome to the edition of TopCoder Interviews.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm actually on here because I won the 2012 International Science and Engineering Fair, and it's essentially the largest international science fair in the entire world. It has 1,500 students from over 70 different countries all competing for one award. And I won the entire thing, and I got $75,000 for my research on creating a new way to detect pancreatic cancer that costs 3 cents and takes 5 minutes to run.
Okay, I mean, I think we could call it wraps right there, right? Now, that's really awesome, right? I mean, obviously, at TopCoder, we're a community that believes in co-creation and competition and collaboration through virtual means. And obviously, the attraction here we wanted to bring you into this audience was, well, we've got this community that runs crowdsourcing and open innovation challenges. You entered this mega science fair, if you will, and you happen to come out on top with this fantastic invention. Can you take us through? Why this innovation was important to you personally, and then how did you start to formulate the ideas of, okay, I'm actually going to attempt this. I'm going to go ahead and try and bring this to reality.
So I actually became interested in pancreatic cancer detection when a close family friend passed from pancreatic cancer. The cancer had metastasized, and it was too late for anything to really be done. And then I found that 85% of all pancreatic cancer patients are diagnosed late when they have less than a 2% chance of survival. And our current modern medicine is a 60-year-old technique. I mean, that's older than my dad. But also, it essentially costs $800 per test and is grossly inaccurate, missing 30% of all cancers. Your doctor has to be ridiculously suspicious in order to give you this test. And so learning this, I was like, well, I mean, that absolutely, is the worst possible thing we can have. That, no matter what I make for detecting pancreatic cancer, it has to be marginally better than that.
Well,
and so I was kind of being optimistic there. I was like, I can do better than this. And so I went on Google and Wikipedia, my trusty friends for knowledge, and essentially I found that in pancreatic cancer, there are a bunch of different biomarkers or proteins found in your bloodstream when you have these different types of cancers. And however, there's no real simple way for detecting these. And so first I found one of these biomarkers called mesothelin that I was going to detect. And mesothelin is just your ordinary run-of-the-mill type protein, unless you have pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer, in which case it's found at very high levels in your bloodstream. But also, it's found in the earliest stages of the disease, when someone has close to a 100% chance of survival. And so then I went back to Google and Wikipedia, and I found these very interesting molecules called carbon nanotubes, essentially long, thin pipes of carbon that are an atom thick and 1/50,000th the diameter of your hair. And essentially, they're kind of like the superheroes of material science, of these incredible properties. And I was taking biology class, reading this article on carbon nanotube properties, and I kind of had to hunt this down, the open source article on it, because I wasn't willing to pay $40 for the actual, legit public article. So I went through a backdoor there, using my friend Google once again. And then we were learning about these things called antibodies. Essentially, molecules are like a lock and key. They only react with one specific protein, in this case, the cancer biomarker. And I was like, hey, if I weave these into this network of carbon nanotubes, then I have a network that only reacts with one specific protein, but also changes its electrical properties based on the amount of protein present. In other words, a new way to detect pancreatic cancer. And I did this using all open source articles. I didn't use one paid article for this, because I'm very cheap when it comes to science fair.
Right, and you're also very young. At the time you're doing this research, I think you're now 16, so at this time you were 15 years old, is that?
I was 14 when I came up with the initial idea.
14 when you came up with the idea. So now, one thing we like to chat about on TopCoder is the two different avenues for, well, two different like thoughts about innovation avenues, right? One is that mad scientist tinkering away and that aha moment, right? And the other is the reapplication of either knowledge or a solution that already exists that's being repurposed. So it sounds like you kind of have a blend of a couple of different things here, where the open source research and using your friends Google and Wikipedia and your best friends there, and looking for some open source articles on this. And then you kind of had the idea that if you combine a couple of these technologies and repurpose them in a new way, that you might have a better chance at improving on what were some pitiful statistics for detecting pancreatic cancer at a stage that is helpful to humans, right? So is that a fair way to sum it up for the people who are watching at home? Is it kind of that meld? And also one quick thing, can you? Do you remember the kind of the moment when you had, was it kind of like a Doc Emmett Brown thing where you thought about the flux capacitor and said, "Oh, Mom, I got it," or how was the initial reaction, or was it more of a slow boil once you realized you might be onto something?
So it's kind of like a mashup of the two. And so one quote that I really love is by Sir Isaac Newton. He said, "I've only seen so far because I've stood on the shoulders of giants." And that's particularly true for my work, because I wouldn't have been able to do this without the research on carbon nanotubes and also on antibodies and these mesothelioma biomarkers. However, I did come up with this really new kind of revolutionary new way to detect these proteins. And my moment, it was very interesting, because I was sitting in biology class and it was kind of a slow boil there, but I suppose that was kind of like a eureka moment in like the grand scheme of all science discoveries. And so it was like I had a bit of a hunch, and then I kind of built on that, and then it was a series of eureka moments, you could say.
Very cool, very cool. So I also read that that for some of this early testing, that you needed access to some specific equipment to go ahead and put this together, and that in and of itself was a bit of a trial, because you went out and reached out to quite a number of places that had access to this equipment and really banged on their doors and said, "Hey, can I borrow it for a while?" Can you give I think this is important, because I think people, when they're trying to innovate and bring an invention to an innovation, which is a different level, there's multiple places in which you could give up, right? And this is one of them, where you could have banged on the 90th door and said, "Forget about it," but lo and behold, the 91st door would have been open to you. Can you let the viewers understand a bit of what it took, what you have to go through, and what kind of equipment were you sourcing, and how'd you go about it?
Yeah, so I actually first did some preliminary experiments just to make sure my method was like actually accurate, and that resulted in me buying carbon nanotubes, bringing them to my house, and culturing E. coli on my kitchen countertop, and making a sensor for E. coli. And despite being very rudimentary, it worked somewhat, and so I was like, okay, I'm going to go with this. And so I emailed 200 different labs at Johns Hopkins and the National Institutes of Health, anyone that had anything to do with pancreatic cancer. And from there, what happened is I emailed them like budget, timeline, procedure, materials list. I got 199 rejections. Some professors were very nasty in their rejections. They were just like, "This entire method is the most foolish thing I've ever seen. It's all wrong. What are you talking about? You're a fool. No one's going to believe you." So some were very mean. Some others were a bit more like soft, like, "Oh, we don't have space in our lab," aka "I don't want you in my lab." And so it was a very interesting learning experience for me. And eventually one professor, Dr. Anirban of Johns Hopkins University, said, "Okay, I might be able to help you." I went in for this interview. It turned out to be a bit of an interrogation. And I go in with like these giant blue ring binders full of like 500 plus journal articles. Go in and I sit down, start talking. I like sees a PhD walking by and say, "Hey, come over here." And like all of a sudden they just start like firing these questions at me, trying to like sync my procedure, making sure I know my stuff. But I got through that and I answered all of their questions. I guessed on quite a few of those, but that's okay. And eventually I got the lab space I needed, and I started working, and I realized how much I didn't know about working in a lab, because I would like sneeze in my cultures and I was like, "Oh, they'll be fine." And then like 5 days later, there were like giant bacteria splotches in them. So I learned quite a lot working in that lab, and it was a very fun experience. It's an invaluable experience, and I love doing research. So it was a great time.
Yeah, very cool. And again, the persistence and of course having to deal with some of the some of the let's call it blind rejection, right? Before even having their minds open to the idea that hey, maybe this is right. They're rejecting it because it's coming from at that time a 15-year-old kid, likely more than anything, right? So take us through one final step before we talk about kind of where you're at now and what the future holds for you, what kind of future you want to shape for yourself now that you've had this early success. But one last stepping stone, once you started to have access to the lab, and obviously you're improving your procedures and you're testing out your solutions, and I'm sure you're getting more and more excited. Besides I'm sure the close-knit people that you could showcase this to that could see what you're doing in the lab, they could see it for themselves. How was the reaction there outside of that net when you started to report and started to say to them, well, I've got something pretty significant here? Was there pushback from any communities? Was there a wide acceptance at that point? Can you let us know how that was going from like an innovator's perspective?
Yeah, so I didn't really receive any pushback. They were just like, oh, wow, I never thought of that. That's really clever. And so I suppose you could say results speak for themselves. And also it was coming from a very credible lab. Dr. Aaron Maisha is an awesome mentor, and he really helped me through this. And it was because like a lot of professors are like, oh, I'll believe it when I see it, and I show it to them, and they're like, oh, that's really fascinating. So it taught me a lot about the research world, about getting results.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's not a bad thing, right? Results based. They tend to drive people's reactions when they can see how well something is working. And for the viewers at home, how does it actually work? Like, what's the physical mechanism, and how does it? How does somebody apply it, or what would a doctor or a physician or a specialist do to use it?
Okay, so I have two explanations, the like insanely scientific one that most people don't understand, and then
go with the Spaceball short version, right? So.
Okay. So essentially, it's like a dye bag test strip, and you put a sixth of a drop of blood on it, and it will change its electrical properties based on the amount of protein present. And from there, I can say you have pancreatic cancer, or you don't have pancreatic cancer. And the reason why it changes electrical properties is because you have these antibodies in this network of carbon nanotubes. And when you place a sample that has that protein in it, that protein will actually go into this network of carbon nanotubes. And it will essentially smash into this antibody and form this larger molecule. And that formation of that larger molecule will push the nanotubes apart, and that will change the electrical properties of the entire network.
Very cool, and great visuals there too, because I think most people could understand that happening on that level. So the last thing before the future of Jack here, what are some of the metrics that when you had this all baked out, when it was all vetted, when you actually won the awards? I know there were some pretty impressive metrics when it came to what was the standard versus where you were. Again, I think you mentioned some at the onset, but could you give us a little more color on some of those?
Okay, so first I'll go with before. So I'll do a before and after picture. So before, you had this $800 test. It missed 30% of all cancers and was really never ordered and was 60 years old. My test costs 3 cents and takes 5 minutes to run. This makes it over 168 times faster, over 26,000 times less expensive, and over 400 times more sensitive than our current standard for pancreatic cancer detection. But also, it requires a little more than a resistance meter that I got from Home Depot and some sewing needles. So it's a very simple approach that really anyone can do it. I'm working on incorporating it into like a glucometer almost. So it's like a diabetes test strip, but for pancreatic cancer. And it also detects ovarian and lung and could be broadly expanded to really any disease, ranging from Alzheimer's to heart disease, other forms of cancer, even HIV/AIDS.
So you're kind of hinting at some of the things that are happening maybe going forward for yourself. So as a nice wrap up, so you've had this, what is a very early success for this day and age, being a 15 and now 16-year-old. So if you're you're in the driver's seat of your own life, of course, but you've really created an avenue for yourself, and that most people don't have, but because of your own hard work, right? So what is next? Well, if it's another 18 months out, 24 months out, 6 months out, 6 weeks out, what is Jack doing? What do you want to see yourself doing, and what kind of avenues are you trying to take this technology, or are you now focusing on brand new technologies that haven't been incorporated yet?
So actually, that 6 weeks estimate was actually very accurate, and it's actually going to be less than that. I believe it's 4 weeks now, the countdown to the International Science and Engineering Fair 2013. So I'm going back with a brand new project. I can't reveal too much details or else my patent lawyer would like kill me. But essentially, I've developed something the size of a sugar cube that's very inexpensive, and it can look into your bloodstream, look at every single protein, and from there diagnose any disease potentially, as well as look at explosives and look at environmental contaminants and potentially anything. So that's going to be my next project, and that's actually tying into what is called the Qualcomm Tricorder X Prize for $10 million. And it's to develop something the size of a smartphone that you pass over your skin and diagnose any disease instantaneously. And traditionally, the teams are these groups of adults and corporations, and in this case, that's holding the same. There's 300 teams of adults and large corporations. And then there's my team. And my team is comprised of all high school students. And we're going to be going for this prize, and I've gathered the all-stars of the science fairs. And so it's going to be very, very exciting. So I have me and my friends working on like hardware, and I have the software team, so it's going to be awesome.
So my only question there is, has a Hollywood executive approached you yet and said, let's get you a few cameras because this is going to be the greatest reality show that mankind has ever seen? Because honestly, that itself, the high school geniuses versus the old hats in an X Prize is going to be really phenomenal. TopCoder and X Prize have a relationship in the sense that we were just out at the IPP X Prize event out in Palo Alto, where our founder was chatting with Peter Diamandis on stage and sharing incentive challenges and the prospects for crowdsourcing and open innovation. So we've got a nice tie to them as well, which is really neat. So I didn't even know you were entering that. I actually know all about it, and that's now I've got somebody to cheer for.